Welcome back, and this is the wood planks material. In this video we're just going to cover a few of the techniques used in here. The main one is probably the brush strokes that are directional based. So if you see here, you can see very on the underlying base that there's these very brushy kind of horizontal strokes. We'll also be looking at the wave effect, but one of the most important aspects of this that isn't so obvious is the color variation. Adding these warm reds and blues just adds a bit more life to the texture, so we'll be taking a look at that. This video won't be going into the bolts or the damage under the bolts or the damage on the planks, but those can be looked at in the SBS that's provided. This can be a scary looking graph, but we'll just be taking a look at a few key elements of it. You're free to check out the full SBS, but in the meantime, let's just go back to the very beginning where we have this layout. In the previous video with the concrete tiles, I explained two different methods for the tiling, one with custom inputs and one without. In this material, I decided against using custom inputs just because there's a lot going on already. But you're free to explore with this. For example, you could do edge splits on some of the planks, or maybe a swirl on some of the planks. Do your own little custom inputs. So what we're going to take a look at is the separation of these lines. How in some areas it starts to blend into one another. So let's take a look at, I'm going to use my own node for height previewing. Everyone has their own ways of checking their height preview, so use whatever you're most comfortable with. So that's how it looks at this early stage, where all the lines are connecting. To break that up, I'm going to use a Gaussian noise and scale that down quite a bit, play with a random seed. And then I'm going to use auto levels just to ensure that we've got the full range of blacks and whites. Then I'm going to use a blend and a add linear dodge. And you can see here already that's working quite nicely. It's starting to fade parts in and out. We can see how that looks. It's quite subtle here, so I'm going to use a levels so that I have more control over that. I kind of like it where it only does it in a few places, but you still get some planks that are fully complete. I'm going to press space just to see how that's looking, although it's difficult with such thin lines. Don't see any obvious tiling there, so continue. And then I just use a flood fill with the original pattern, and then a flood fill to gradient, and then just mess around with the angle. I don't like these black lines being there, so I'm just going to use a distance node to get rid of those black lines. That's how it was before, that's how it is now. And then we can use that to multiply on top. I always like to dial them down when I'm about to test something, just so that I can dial it in and see it in effect. I'll show you what I mean here. And that's already looking pretty good. You might notice some oddities like this, but we're going to be edge sculpting, so between that and some edge deformation, we should be able to alleviate most of these issues. So in the previous video, we took a look at how to create brushy surfaces using the more quicker, simple method. Here we're going to try something a bit more complex. It's just a shape that we eventually turn into a brush stroke, which would be something like this. And then we run it through a tile sampler. So all it is this shape blurred so that we get some smoother corners, and then clamp it. And more blur. If anything, this is just to give us a bit more control. And then running it through a slope blur, set to min, with a directional noise that is then blurred. And you can go back, like I said, you've got this extra control. You can make more stronger strokes, or you can get ones with more fall off. Depends what you're going for. And then we run that through a directional warp with a fractal sum base. So again, you've got more control over here to get different, to really just get the type of brush stroke you want. Here I just use the transform 2D to put it in the middle. If you have OCD, that's useful. And then running it through a directional with a anastrophic noise and uniform blur to really soften out that initial anastrophic blur, which is quite intense. And then pushing that multiple times. So I've got 3 here. So I push it in this direction, in this direction, in this direction, just to try and move the brush strokes around. And then putting over a gradient linear one, and then clamping it a bit more to make it a bit more solid, and then just running this through again. A lot of this can really be customized how you want it to be. This is just a general way of going about creating a brushstroke. You can actually create multiple interesting brushstrokes, which I would encourage, and create multiple pattern inputs to get more variation in your tiling brushstrokes. When putting it through a tile sampler, like a really important one is to ramp up the symmetry random. Without it, everything's just going exactly the same way. But if you put it to 1, it's turning them around at 180-degree angles. And for wood, that works really well. So I think with this transform 2D, I kind of squashed it down to get more of a grainy effect. And then I offset it with the luminosity of the planks. And then run that through a auto levels. Again, another gradient map with very little color additions. And again, I use the mip-map technique with a histogram scan of the tile sampler after it's been squashed down. And then offset that one again. And we just use that to mask out some. So before this, is a bit too noisy, it would be nice to have some areas that are broken up a bit more with more flatter areas like this. And then all that's doing really is we pick a default color and just overlay this texture on top. And you can play around with this and the blend modes as well to get what you want. So it's more of a, we're not using this, it's more of a addition to your base color. So this would be a good point to talk about the color variation that we have going here. So it's actually these 5 nodes that are mostly doing it. So if we just plug this straight in, this is it without the color variation, and this is it with. So how did we do that? Well, first of all, there's a flood fill to gradients with angle variation, and then using this histogram scan to dial it in and out. So this is it without. And I'll also show it with. And you can see how this is helping to break up some of the ends of the planks. Then next we have a more bluish color. And again, that's a flood fill to gradient with angle variation. It's a very subtle, only 20% in there. This is it without and with. Next one is a color variation. So this is quite almost like a old school method that we used to use back in the day with Photoshop. So for example, if we had like a wood texture, imagine this is a photoreal wooden texture, we'd sometimes just create really wild maps that we would overlay in the Photoshop file. With just a range of different colors. And then in here, it would just be such a subtle overlay, like something like this. Even that might be too much. But compared to not having it, it just quickly adds a lot of interest, and it also breaks up areas so that it's not so flat. And that's kind of what I'm doing here with this one, where I've plugged in just a flood fill to luminosity and plugged it into a gradient map with multiple different colors. And like I showed you before, it's a very, very subtle overlay, or multiply in this case. So that's it with. But as you can see, it's just dialed down a lot. So this is it without, and this is it with. Just helps break it up a little with different colors. This one is just a luminosity grayscale plugged into a gradient map so that it works, and then we can use that just to separate each one just by dark and light values. So this is it without, and this is it with. And then the final one is the flood fill to gradients, but again, grayscale with a gradient map. The gradient map is just unaffected. You don't need to do anything with that like before. And this is it without it. This is it with. Again, just add some more subtle gradation. Again, it's quite low. It's a very subtle effect, but all combined with all 5 of these, it's much better than just this. So again, without and with. Let's take a look at edge highlights now. So this is it without, and this is it with. And it's just a very simple map here. In the previous video, in the concrete tiles, we created very specific edge highlights with the corners. but sometimes you just want general highlighting. To do this, the first task really is to go back into your height chain and figure out where you want to start pulling your information from. In this case, I didn't want edge highlights on the bolts or the small grain. Really just wanted to take it from where the shaping and pattern and the form of the material was more complete. That's around here. So we can use a height to normal world units. And let's just compare that to a normal to explain why sometimes this can be more useful, the height to world units. So if we plug this into the normal, now with normal you get intensity, but with this you get more control. But with the sampling, you can actually avoid some of these really sharp details and sometimes anti-aliasing with Sebel, which smooths it out. This might be a bit too much for photoreal, but with stylized materials, it can actually work quite nicely. So then we just plug that into a curvature smooth to get our lights and different tones. And then from that, we can use, there's a few methods. There's histogram select. There's histogram scan. Sorry, the previous ones are just an edge select. And then there's the histogram scan. And then there's the histogram select. The edge select can be good for shadows in particular between grout, and you've got control over it being convex or concave. So a lot of control there, but for me and generally, the one that I use a lot is the histogram select. So from there, you can just clamp it or get further control with the levels. And then just as an option, you can plug that into a blend and put a luminosity into the top. That's this map. And multiply just to break it up a bit. And there's a perfectly fine edge map. But again, like that was mentioned before, with this node in particular, you've got a bit more control. You can not only affect this, but you can also affect the histogram select and the levels to get exactly the type of edge wear that you need. And then, yeah, with this, I made it quite stylized by going quite extreme with some of the edges with the histogram select, and then just plugging that into a blend with just a standard simple flat color and copy with some transparency. And again, just to show you the effectiveness of that, we can put this down to 0 and put it up to 0.7. So you can see it just pushes some of those planks out a bit more, makes it a bit more interesting to look at. This is how the wood looks after a few more tweaks. It's really just the directional brush tiling base that sells it, along with the color variation methods that we looked at, as well as some of the extreme breakup of the pattern that you can see here. So yeah, next we'll be taking a look at a metal material in which we'll be focusing on more complex brush generation. We'll go over the creation of stylized damage along with highlights and shadows, as well as an initial look into creating roughness maps for stylized materials. We'll go over the creation of stylized damage along with highlights and shadows, as well as an initial look into creating roughness maps for stylized materials.